Richard Speck, a 24-year-old loner, broke into a townhouse on the East 100th Street on Chicago's southeast side, which served as a makeshift dormitory for the nursing school at the South Chicago Community Hospital. Speck entered the dormitory in the darkness of the night, and once inside, he stumbled across 8 nurses. And it was right at this moment that the state of Chicago was about to change forever. Speck led the nurses like lambs to the slaughter during an attack that lasted 5 hours, where he brutally strangled and stabbed 8 nurses in cold blood. Speck had confronted the women, tying them up with shredded bed sheets, and promised only to rob them and nothing else, with another nurse coming home a bit later too, who was then also tied up as well. Now Speck, being the demented killer he was, then took the women from the room one by one, killing each of them in different parts of the house in a sadistic onslaught where he slashed their throats, stabbed them, and even committed rape. You can only imagine the fear, the trauma that these poor women would have been experiencing. One by one, he killed each and every one, butchering them to satisfy his lust for killing. But whilst this was going on, and distracted by his own killing spree, and unbeknown to Beck, who didn't realise that one of his hostages had actually hidden under a bunk bed until the massacre was over, and at the right time she seized her opportunity to extricate herself from this horrific massacre. She then managed to jump from a window and ran like the clappers and kept running for her life. All this victim recalled of Speck, apart from being pure evil and the complete fear she felt at the time, was his tattoo, and one that read, "Born to Raise Hell." Yes, a tattoo engraved with exactly that. Speck was a personification of pure evil, manifested by a twisted and warped mind that it defied any comprehension. A cold-blooded killer walking amongst us with a cruel and demented disposition, who was living up to the very inscription that he adorned on his flesh. Simply unfathomable and just pure evil. After the killing, Speck went into hiding, leaving the city paralysed and gripped with fear for several days, not knowing when he would strike next, and also whilst trying to comprehend the reality of what had happened. I mean, who could be so evil as to butcher 8 helpless nurses one by one and so brutally? This madman was on the loose and had a thirst for blood, and no one, and I mean no one, was safe in the fear that he would pop up whilst they lay in their beds. However, by chance, and a few days later, the cold-blooded murderer arrived at County Cook Hospital following a failed suicide attempt, and an eagle-eyed doctor recognised the tattoo from the news coverage, and he was swiftly apprehended, and the murderer was thankfully taken off the streets. Now, it was said at the time that this was the first random mass murder of the 20th century. It really was the end of an age of innocence, and it did change everything, and everyone just became more conscious of their security. 8 nurses could be slaughtered in their beds so easily, and for no reason, by an evil and demented killer who had never even met them before. And even to this day, no one really knows why Speck, the spawn of Satan, chose those particular nurses on that particular day, as darkness descended upon their poor souls. Speck stated at the time of the killings, he said, "I had no feelings at all that night. They said there was blood all over the place. I can't remember. It felt like nothing. I'm sorry as hell for those girls and for their families and for me. If I had to do it again, it would be a simple house burglary." And Speck's final thought for the American people was, "Just tell them to keep up their hatred for me. I know it keeps up their morale. I don't know what I'd do without it." On April the 15th, after 1 hour of deliberation, the jury found Speck guilty and recommended the death penalty. And on June the 5th, Judge Herbert Passion sentenced Speck to die in the electric chair, and all of his appeals were unsuccessful. In 1971, his death sentence was, however, reversed due to issues with jurors from the original trial, and instead he was resentenced to between 400 to 1,200 years in prison. He then later died of a heart attack on the 5th of December 1991 whilst awaiting the electric chair. Richard Speck was gone, but his terrifying and murderous legacy still haunts the people of Chicago to this day. And when you close your eyes tonight, just think for 1 second what you would do if Richard Speck was standing in the shadows, staring directly at you with a demented look in his eyes. It doesn't bear thinking about. Richard Benjamin Speck was a barbaric and evil murderer, and let us never forget this incident of the victims of this horrific crime.